Hi guys, so this is just an introduction to the clinical psychology unit for AP Psych. I just want to start by saying that this unit most students find very interesting because I think it touches everyone. If you have not personally been touched by psychological disorders and mental illness, you likely know someone that has, or you will know someone that has. You yourself might even be touched by this in the future. And so I think that this is something that a lot of students really connect with and really understand the real world applications to. With that said, I hope that you learn a lot. I hope that just by learning and educating and understanding about mental illness, that it will reduce the stigma. I think the more we know, the better we are, that we know how to seek help and we understand when things aren't right, or when the way we're feeling is different. We can recognize those things, or we can recognize them in other people. And so I just think that this is a great unit for that, for you to understand just more about mental health and mental illness. Another thing just to start off with and know going into it, when I call this psychology student syndrome, but a lot of times whenever we're learning about different symptoms, you start to see things that you recognize in yourself. And I don't want you to start diagnosing yourself and diagnosing other people first, because you don't have that certification and neither do I. But also a lot of these behaviors and thoughts are just extreme versions of things that we already have. Everyone has moods. Everyone knows what it's like to feel sad or to feel happy. And so some of these are just extremes of things that you might feel every day. And so you might recognize some of those feelings, but don't be too quick to think that you might have an illness as you're learning about this. However, if something really does connect with you, it resonates with you, and you feel like it's explaining something that you have not understood in yourself, and you really want to talk to someone about how you feel, definitely reach out. I'm not a certified therapist. I can't diagnose, I can't treat, but I can help you find someone that can get you help, and I can give you contact information to contact people who can help. And so just reach out to me if you feel like you need to talk to someone, and I can get you in contact with someone that can be a better resource for you. Okay, so as we start, the first thing that you need to know is what makes a behavior or a thought process something that's considered abnormal. And so the textbook gives us 4 characteristics of a behavior that would be abnormal. It has to meet all 4. So some behaviors might be one of these. That does, if the behavior is just atypical, then it's not considered disordered behavior. It has to be atypical and disturbing and unjustifiable and maladaptive. It has to meet all 4 characteristics in order for that behavior to be considered an abnormal behavior. So we just should define these just really quickly so you know what each of these are. And then going through, you can see how when we're looking at symptoms of different illnesses, you can see how these symptoms are all 4. They are atypical, they are disturbing, they are unjustifiable, and maladaptive. So I think the hardest one is maladaptive, because I just don't think it's a word that everyone uses in common everyday language, but maladaptive just means that that behavior or that thought pattern or thought process is a destructive behavior. And I think destructive kind of sounds like you're physically hurting yourself or you're physically hurting someone else, and that can absolutely be the case, but it doesn't have to be physical. The behavior or thought process could just be something that is harmful to you mentally. It could even just be harmful to your routine. So for example, one behavior might be if someone is their sleep patterns, they're always sleeping in, they're feeling really sad, they're crying a lot, they're not, their appetite, they have a loss of appetite. Those things are destructive. Their routine is impaired because their sleeping pattern is messed up, their eating pattern is, their appetite has changed. Those are all considered destructive. They're maladaptive behaviors. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like a literal hurting myself or hurting someone else, which it absolutely could. But so that's what maladaptive is. An unjustifiable behavior would be it doesn't seem to have a rational explanation. So, for example, if you saw someone in Walmart and they were wearing a costume, you might think, that's different. But it might be justified. They might be coming back from a costume party, or they might be coming back from some kind of sporting event where they were dressed up, and so that would be a justified behavior. It makes sense. But some behaviors, the person is acting or thinking in a way that there isn't a rational explanation for. They should not be feeling or acting or thinking in that way. The behavior also has to be disturbing, just meaning that other people are observing and upset by that behavior. So the person themselves might see nothing wrong with the behavior or the thought process, but when other people observe, they feel upset by whatever that behavior is that person is displaying. The fourth one is atypical. So it's got to be all of these. This behavior has to be maladaptive, unjustifiable, disturbing, and atypical. Atypical would be something that goes against the norm. So it's just not a typical behavior that you would see in people of that age or that group. So there is a whole classification of all of these different these different behaviors. So if someone is exhibiting a behavior that meets those four characteristics, that might be considered abnormal. And if this is concerning to someone and they reach out to a professional, the professional is going to try to figure out how to define what's happening, what illness, what disorder. And so what they'll do is they'll go to the Diagnostic, Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is the DSM. It is called the DSM-5 because it's on the 5th version. And so they rewrite, revise, and it's on the 5th version. This is the current version. And so a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a doctor, in order to diagnose someone, they're going to take those things that are considered abnormal behaviors or thought processes that are disturbing, destructive, they're atypical, and they're going to figure out what are all the symptoms, and they're going to figure out what disorder does it best fit with. And so the DSM, it doesn't give a way to treat or all of the possible causes, but what the DSM does is it gives a list of symptoms. And if a person meets, typically it'll say a certain amount of symptoms. For this disorder, they must meet 2 out of 5 of the symptoms, or 5 out of the 9 symptoms. And so if a psychologist sits down and they match all of the behaviors that this person has and they meet a certain amount of symptoms, they're going to diagnose with that disorder. And so in order to have any kind of prescription, they're going to need a medical professional is going to have to classify through the DSM. The DSM has new versions because we're always coming out with new technologies, new understandings, different ways to research. We're always learning more about the brain. And society changes on what is typical and atypical, and so that is a factor too on behaviors, and so it changes, and so we're on the 5th version. And then lastly, depending on who you go to see, if you're concerned about either in yourself or someone else, they're going to take a different approach. So, or they might take one of these approaches. These are the current approaches to understanding psychological disorders. And they're both, you'll understand when you hear this, you'll be like, that I understand. If you go to a doctor, they're going to likely take the medical model. So an understanding psychological disorders, doctors and psychiatrists are often going to take the approach of there's a physical cause, something genetic or biological, something they can pinpoint. They're going to classify, they're going to look at all the symptoms, they're going to diagnose, and they're probably going to treat with medication, maybe hospitalization, but they're going to have this physical cause, some biological cause. We see the symptoms and now we're going to treat medically. That's one approach. Another approach, a current approach, is this combination approach. So it's called the biopsychosocial model. And so this approach would be going to maybe a psychologist, maybe a therapist, and they're going to look at the nature and the nurture. So the biological side of the causes, what genetically could be predisposing you to this illness, what's going on as far as the psychological factor, trauma, moods, stress, and then they're also going to look at what could be impacting you socially, culturally, what norms, expectations, and just roles, things like that. What are all of these factors together doing to impact the way you think and feel and act? And so they're going to take that kind of approach rather than just looking at the biological side. They're going to take in all these other factors and try to explain what's going on. And so that's the biopsychosocial model. And that's where we're at today. In the textbook, it does talk about how we've come as a society and understanding what mental illness was, hundreds of years ago, and how it's changed into looking at it as not madness, but an illness, that people are sick and can be treated. And so make sure that you're going back to the textbook and you're making, sure that you're getting all those pieces. But here are the main points, just that you can understand how to classify if a behavior is abnormal. So the 4 characteristics. What is the DSM? What's its purpose? And also the approaches, the medical model and the biopsychosocial model. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I hope this was helpful, and I hope you have a great day.